and welcome. I'm Eric Miscoll, and welcome to this episode of the Eric Miscoll Show. As always, I have Phil Stoten joining me as my co-host from Down Under. Thank you, Phil, for joining us again today. Topic today is cybersecurity as it applies to concerns within the EMS industry. You know, we scheduled this several weeks ago, and as if by demand, we had a ransomware attack in the industry with the facility, the Foxconn facility down in Tijuana. So for the record, we had nothing to do with that. We just scheduled a show. We thought
we're just hyping the show, Eric. Is that the trouble you go to get?
Yeah, exactly. That's good promotion, isn't it? So. But anyway, so what we've done is we invited two industry gentlemen to join us to share their expertise and their opinions on a lot of the topics related to this. So let me introduce real quick before I allow them to introduce themselves. We have Michael Ford, Senior Director of Emerging Industry Strategy within Aegis Software. Welcome back, Michael. And we have Matt Konda. Matt is the CEO of Jemurai. It's our first time on the show. So welcome, Matt. We're glad to have you as a part of this conversation. Matt came highly recommended through an industry colleague on this particular topic. So we're glad to have him join us. Before we get into the questions, I always like to allow our guests to introduce themselves. Matt, since you're the newbie on this one, I'll begin with you. Why don't you tell us about yourself and Jemurai?
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. My name is Matt Konda. I'm a software engineer by training, so sort of technical security is what interests me. We do consulting where we help people build secure software. We also build a platform called securityprogram.io, which can be used to broadly implement security measures across your organization, whether they're technical or process or otherwise. My claim to fame may be that I was on the OWASP Global Board between 2015 and 2018. OWASP is a community of application security experts of about 40,000 people, the predominant community in that area. And we help a lot of smaller companies with cybersecurity, and that means we see things front and center. And I hope that some of those stories will be interesting today.
Yeah. And for clarity, not all of your customers necessarily are within the electronics manufacturing industry.
That's correct. Okay. That's correct.
Good. Thank you. Michael.
Also a software engineer. Been in the industry for almost 40 years now. I haven't done software for a while. But working with Aegis Software, providing MES solutions for the industry, electronics and beyond, of course. And, you know, what we see every day is massive amounts of data, you know, big data from all aspects of manufacturing. Of course, people want to use it for so many different things. I mean, there's so much richness of value that comes from that. And so a part of my work is with IPC to help create standards which allow interoperability for this data for different purposes, and including the security of it, so that we can all be smart and secure in one ecosystem where everything is complementary to another. So this is part of my role also.
Very good. Well, thank you both. Well, let's get into it. I referenced the ransomware incident here at the beginning, but you know, it's more than just that when you think about cybersecurity. So Michael, why don't I start with you? What are the primary kind of types of threats or challenges inherent within EMS, especially with all the manufacturing data that you're referenced there?
It's end to end. You start out with design data, which is kind of thrown over the wall from a customer, often emailed using unsecure techniques. So there is the threat of taking intellectual property that can be used to make clones or at least get competitive advantages through the use of the technology. Then there's manufacturing information. What is your capacity? When is your delivery? When is that new market introduction going to take place? A lot of commercial information. You've got private information in there about customers, suppliers, employees, and you've also got operational information. You know, how are my machines working right now? What if I were to make some adjustment remotely, as so many of these machines can do right now? How would that disrupt manufacturing? So as we become smarter and use all of this data, we've also got to be aware that there's an equal number of people out there who may want to just trip us up. And so, this is really part of what we need to look at as we, go forward in using more information.
Yeah. And when you say trip up, I mean, in what are the most common ways then that they seek to trip us up?
Well, the IT side is one thing. And what is often neglected is the OT, the operational technology side of the network, where we have hundreds or even thousands of machines joined together on a network, where there is little scope for virus protection. All of the machines may be using an old version of the software like Windows 7 or XP, simply because that's how the machine was made to work, and it's never been upgraded since. And so you imagine all of the security flaws that have accumulated since the time that machine was made, and suddenly you're seeing machines infecting each other. I went into one factory and there was a general slowdown. And it was actually that they were mining Bitcoin. All of the computers around manufacturing were mining Bitcoin at the same time as operating the factory. So, I think a really big problem here is, what do you do in manufacturing? Because it is different from other areas of the office or a business where, normal firewalls and safe practices can be established effectively. In manufacturing, you just don't get that opportunity to enforce them.
And is that true? Is that true on-prem as well as for people that are using cloud, Michael? Because we've seen a switch from on-prem to cloud in the last few years, haven't we? That's been quite substantial.
Yeah, personally, from the security aspect, I see that there are different problems, because anything that you put in the cloud is out there. It's a target, so people could access it. Sometimes having things on-prem means it's on effectively the dark web, because you can't get to it from outside. Nobody knows it's there. If you don't know where it is and what it is, how can you attack it? Unless you send some kind of random attack in to try and find something. But, a lot of the solutions in the industry use proprietary databases. So they can be quite difficult to hack, even legitimately, never mind from somebody wanting to do some damage. But, the threat is out there, and we need to have security protocols in place for both of those scenarios.
Matt, what do you see as the nightmare scenarios that we should be concerned about, apart from ransomware and loss of IP, which I think is a hugely important one?
Well, spinning off of what Michael raised, which I think were great points across a variety of aspects of business, is that in any business, there's a sense of risk. And there are points in that process you're doing that can fail. In software, we talk about use cases, like what are we building the software to do? And if you were to model your business as a bunch of use cases, the things you're doing, something you could do is step back and think about abuse cases, like where could this go wrong? So for example, most of our clients have had false requests sent to their finance department asking to change some sort of accounting distribution account to a new false one, right? And so you need to have a process in place to validate that this account change is correct, is being done on behalf of the person you're actually trying to pay, for instance. And so what I would advocate in terms of that is stepping into what are your real risks and what are your biggest risks? And I think ransomware is a risk because it affects continuity and it affects finance, right? You're going to end up paying a ransom potentially. And as such, I think it is one of the most relevant. I think others that we see all the time are phishing. So one of the things that's tricky about cybersecurity industry, in my opinion, is that there are all these really fancy use cases that people get excited to talk about. But a lot of times the places that things fall down are actually basic flows of information that are just being misused, essentially.
Yeah, I always equate it to if somebody was to physically break into your house, because you see the doors open, there's something been smashed. Have they taken the valuables, the jewelry, whatever? Have they seen my account details? Have they taken something that could embarrass me? Not that I have anything like that, but we all have things and we're wondering. We don't know. The problem is you just don't know. And a lot of these attacks are kind of what we call complex attacks, where you see something that is on its own, yeah, like, as you said, Matt, just a phishing or something simple. But then you see something a little while later, and you see something a little while later, and you think in isolation, all of them are just small things, we can tame to them. But what you don't see is what's happening in the background, that these are combining together to create, you know, sources of information or the preparation for ransomware. And so sometimes the real danger has been hidden. And often people find that when they realize they've been hacked, it wasn't yesterday or last month, it was years ago.
Yeah, and it's just there doing its dirty work somewhere in the background. Matt, how common are these attacks? You know, are we in a situation when we're hyping fear, or is there more of it than we hear about? I mean, obviously, not everybody's going to put their hand up and say, "Hey, we were hacked," or "Hey, we lost some data," or "We had to pay ransomware," or something of that nature. People are going to be nervous about discussing it, aren't they?
Yeah, I think you won't see companies disclosing these kinds of attacks voluntarily in many cases, although there are interesting SEC rules that are in the process of being approved that would require public companies to disclose breaches, which I think would be interesting for the industry. I think on the one hand, I want to sort of agree with your point that everybody's being attacked all the time. So if you have something on the network, absolutely in a day, it's getting attacked no matter what, right? If you have an email account with Google or Microsoft, somebody's tried to guess a password for it. That's happened, right? It's just 100%, that's definitely happened. But the response to that often is to sort of shut down and say, well, I can't do anything about it anyway, or I don't know where to focus. And that's why I like to think of a risk-based approach when I think about security. We talk about threat modeling, which is like a sort of advanced way to do this. But the analogy I always end up using when I teach about this is the bear and the people running from the bear. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than your friend, right? I don't know if you've heard that analogy.
Yeah.
Well, that's the whole wrong analogy in cybersecurity, because it's all automated, right? Like it's not a being, it's not a sentient person that's trying to attack you. It's a huge network of machines.
It's a network.
And so they can attack everything on the planet every day, right?
Wow. Yeah.
So that's the mindset that we have to now figure out. Like, you're definitely targeted. The question is, are you targeted by somebody who's trying to, pretend they're Phil and get on the show? Or are they, just like bouncing on Zoom, like guessing URLs, right? It's just luck if they get in. It's a different scenario.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So,
and what do you, sorry, I was going to ask Michael, from a manufacturing point of view, when you look at it from either an in-house or a contract manufacturer, what's the nightmare scenario? What's the biggest risk? Is it that loss of intellectual property? Is that the brand's biggest concern? Or is it just
really
everything being grinding to a halt with the risk of a ransom to get it going again?
If I were the manufacturer, the real problem is what happens at the customer, for the customer, because it's a loss of face in a sense, which is why people are tempted to cover these things up. But then there's the potential damage, because do you really know what has been affected? So for example, if I was making products with programmable FPGAs, has that been tampered with in some way over the last 3 years, since I now know when it first happened? And those products in the market that belong to my customer, how are they going to react when they realize that their brand image is going to suffer? There's going to be huge costs involved, which may be for nothing, and maybe everything's fine, or maybe there's something quite nasty behind it. It's that not knowing that causes the problem, but the pain will come from the customer. To be honest, when you get to that stage, the fact that a line has stopped or not is not the highest of your problems, which is unusual, because normally that is the highest of your problems.
Yeah.
But it's the whole scenario where you've got to go through and face the music with the customer.
Yeah.
Mm. Hey, Matt, I want to come back to something you just said too, because I'm thinking about the purpose of these attacks or these things. In ransomware, it's clear they're trying to make money, right? The example you use where there's somebody's trying to change an account number so that they, it's clear what's going on. But then you also reference just these networks of computers that are just constantly pinging, right, and causing. So is it always a nefarious thing? Is it always so what's the purpose behind some of these?
Well,
just to cause
there's a broad set of objectives, but I think certainly we have clients who get hacked to just harness the compute resources to mine Bitcoin, for instance. It's a common thing, right? So I can still, usually there's a financial motive. But if there's not a financial motive, there's often a intellectual property motive, where people are just trying to get into systems so that they can steal information. That's usually more like a nation state type of adversary. But for most companies, preventing the former, the somebody can get into your system and start mining Bitcoin, or somebody can change the financial flow in your system. Those are the things that I would probably focus on first, because the nation state actors are very difficult to face anyway.
Okay.
Actually, one of the interesting things is that a lot of the people who, let's say they are targeting something, they want to achieve a certain goal, they will use tools to achieve that end, but they've got to cover their tracks. How are they going to do that? Well, quite often these people simply share what they're doing with all of their friends on the dark web, and they all start doing similar attacks to other people. So it kind of covers their tracks. It hides the fact that a specific attack has been made. So probably 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 has been specifically coordinated to achieve something, whether it's a counterfeit product or create a clone or create a security risk, whatever. And then the others are just me too's where, yeah, we'll have some of that and we'll use the same tools to make a quick buck or two.
There's also the fact that there's a supply chain on their side too. So there's people who will break in and then sell access to your system. So the person who breaks in just wants to make money because they can provide access. And somebody else wants to buy that access to do the next thing, right? And it depends on who you are.
Yeah. So they've got quite a sophisticated supply chain, outsourcing, as a service offerings, all kinds of unpleasant stuff going on their side as well.
Hey,
I like to use the example of, your adversary may be a group of college educated people who get paid benefits in a place where hacking is not thought of ethically with the same sort of ethical standard that we use. So it's a team of people working together on what are considered, acceptable business objectives, which are to, get out and get information.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, you referenced the issue too about the components, right? So talk about that kind of with counterfeit components and the problems that those can cause or create in this regard for manufacturers.
There's a whole plethora of different things that can happen. Sometimes you get a kind of shortage of a particular component and supplier doesn't want to be the one that fails. He's under contract, he's got penalties. He might just choose another component that has a poorer tolerance or something like that, poorer quality. Maybe it's not an approved vendor, and try and sneak it in. There are active decisions made then to accept those kinds of things. So they can be classed as counterfeit. Other counterfeits are ones where you've taken chips and specifically remarked them and then repainted them so that you wouldn't know that they were a different specification. Sometimes you get a little plastic brick on legs with nothing inside whatsoever, as people are just trying to con you. Sometimes you get the real nefarious cases. We had a case where a reel of parts for SMT, the first 200 parts on there were genuine, and every 7th one after that was counterfeit. And I was thinking, who would go to that much effort?
That's a lot of work. Yeah.
To gain just 1 in 7 after the 200? It just doesn't make financial sense. But there are a lot of people for whom that represents a huge value opportunity. You scale that up, you've defeated incoming inspection, you've caused confusion in manufacturing. It's just a quality problem perhaps. And so you get away with it. So it's that risk element. The risk goes down, Okay, the reward is less, but you scale it up and things work. But then you also have the really nasty attacks where you have somebody who wants to make something fail. And that can be, the remote control of a car, the remote control of aircraft, drones, all of which are enabled by backdoors. How do you get a backdoor in there? You either need to get a copy of the software, you need to perhaps make a hardware tweak as well. You need to know where the shipments are going so that you can intercept the hardware or replace the software, which even can be done. Even factories can be making their own counterfeits now. If you've changed the design data or adjusted the software, they think they're making genuine products, but they're actually not. It's a bit of a minefield. And just sometimes you get into real trouble where, you've got a product in the market. There was one case where there was a little house cleaning robot, and it went around connecting to your Wi-Fi, went into your computer, stripped everything out, sent all the data off to its owner. And it's just a simple household product. So anything from a car to a little product, even your phone, or, there's so many ways that people can start to get your data.
Yeah. And there's a willingness to connect, isn't there? You buy something at, even at the market or somewhere like that, and you take it home and you connect it to your Wi-Fi, and it's connected to everything else, I guess. So we're aware of these risks, but we're not very good at taking care. How do we go ahead, Michael?
I mean, this is in an environment that Matt will be familiar with, where you're providing the ultimate protection for a business critical thing. All of these things are thought about, they're done, you've got plans for everything, software that does amazing things. But when you've got somebody that buys a doorbell from a shop, as you said, and it's part of their alarm system and their key for their door, they're just thinking that all of that was done for them. And they don't realize that that is all dependent on their home security, which probably doesn't even exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've just connected something to it that's connected to whatever external source. So how do we get smarter about this, Matt?
Well, I like to think that, circling back to a previous comment I made about abuse cases, that we need to put on our hats, like put on your attacker hat and spend a little bit of time and energy and money thinking about what your risks are and what your negative cases could be. Unfortunately, it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that in software. It's hard to do that in manufacturing. It's hard to take a step back and give yourself the time to think through what could go wrong and invest in the preventative measures. But if you don't do that, I don't think you can really address the bigger issue.
Okay.
That feels a little bit wishy-washy as an answer, so I apologize, but it's sort of
no. You got to get in the head of the bad guy, haven't you?
Has different main priorities, and that makes it hard to provide like here's the recipe to be okay. But it is a segue to why standards are important, because standards help you to do things systematically across your organization so that you're following good practices. And so becoming aware of those standards and thinking about how they may apply to you and how you can use them effectively in a positive way might be a way to spin this into a useful, directed conversation.
Yeah. Michael, I know if we give you the topic of standards, you've got lots to add. Before we do that, I was just curious, Matt, you're involved in many industries, including the electronic manufacturing space. Is the electronic manufacturing space doing more or less than typically industries are doing? Are we in a worse position? Are we in a better position? We have a lot of data, so I know that makes us vulnerable.
It's hard to generalize, but I think there are a couple of big picture comments I would make. One is, I think many of the people we work with are aggressively moving to cloud technology, and that allows them to use things in the cloud that are very useful from a security perspective, including things like backing up data, encrypting data, turning on intrusion detection like guard duty in AWS. Those are all just check boxes when you're in the cloud. Like, you literally don't need to have a dedicated security professional to use them, but you have to understand what you're doing and you have to decide to use them. So many of our customers are aggressively moving to the cloud. I think that has not been so much the case in what I've seen in the EMS industry. I think there's also a concept of how much are you building software? How sensitive do you think your data is? How aggressively are you looking at IT as transformational technology? Are you part of a, digital transformation? Is IT central to your business, or is it just something you're using to track what you're doing? And for the firms that are looking at IT as transformational, they're getting used to making investments, and then they're getting used to thinking about security as part of that investment. And I would say that obviously there's a broad set of culprits in every industry, but I would say, EMS, it's sort of, I wouldn't necessarily characterize everybody as being on the bleeding edge of digital transformation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, we'd agree with that. Michael, standards. Why are they so important, and what's going on with them?
I work a lot with the IPC standards, but I'm not a fan of standards, actually, a lot of the standards, because in many cases, standards kind of bring burden for manufacturing. Talking about CMMC, for example, where, we accept the fact that there's risk. Wherever there's risk, there's going to be a problem happening. If a problem could happen, then let's put in a lot of paperwork to make sure that we document everything. And so CMMC brings a huge burden for the operational side and reporting side for many small businesses that, they're supplying a larger business, so they have to follow more intricate rules. People just hate these standards. They know they need them because it's a part of the game that's been played and it protects them. But where is the value? Where is the benefit? If you're not intending to have a cyber attack, you shouldn't really need them if you're careful, if you do everything properly. Well, Matt and I know that that's not true. You need them. You have to go through these processes. But one of the more interesting areas of the standards is from IPC. In fact, just a few minutes ago, we had a vote through for the IPC cybersecurity standard, which is not at all concerned with the IT network. It's focused on the OT side. So, for example, what is the procedure that you follow to identify when you have had a cyber attack on the OT network? What are the tools there to detect it? How do you then decide what type of attack it was? How do you decide the effect and the scope of it? And so there is this a diploma that somebody would have for their factory, which is to say, I can now issue a digital certificate that it makes the assurance that my products have been made in a cyber secure environment. So that digital certificate is just a number, it's a code that you have just to say that that product was made in that factory at that time. And in fact, all of the materials have that as well. So if a cyber attack happens, you then go forward to find out, is this a cyber intrusion? In other words, has a product been affected by this cyber attack? And if it has, this standard is defining what do you do. So all of these steps are defined. And so that you inform your suppliers, you inform your customers, you are able to isolate the scope to what may be affected. And so this is the value of the standard. It's related to traceability, it's related to ERP and the supply chain, but it's providing a simple way to be able to provide the assurance that manufacturing has been done in a cybersecure environment from both the OT perspective and, of course, the IT perspective.
Okay.
I didn't expect to be defending CMMC today, but I might, if I can, briefly.
Go for it.
I mean, it's been a fraught process as the standard has evolved and changed, and it isn't very clear how it applies, who needs to do what. I think those are all challenges for the standard. On the other hand, some of the things it's based on, including NIST 853, NIST 800-171, all are imperfect, but all give you at least something concrete to work toward. And I think, part of thinking about cybersecurity differently is figuring out what are your actual risks and what are the things you're going to embrace and do. And it may be hard to say, I don't want to compete for this DoD work because it costs too much. The barrier to entry is too high. But the reality is that's true for many companies, and they just don't think about it, or they don't make that decision. And as much as I want every company to have a chance to compete. And so I don't like the idea of a heavy standard that people need to follow. I also understand that, devices that are in the field need to have good security measures in place. And that's not something that we can just hand wave about or think is going to be true because we talked about it. You know what I'm saying? And so it's a very hard problem, but I think there's a benefit to the standard. And part of doing well with cybersecurity is shifting the mindset to say, I care about this. I want those contracts. This is valuable. And the people that we see succeed over time make that commitment on an ongoing basis. And that's a key success factor. So sorry for going on a train there.
I think that's an excellent point, because this is probably the most important thing that people are going to face in manufacturing is compliance with CMMC. And a lot of, if I look at the CMMC, I am software engineer background, and I have done a little bit about security and all this, and I just look at it and glaze over. I just think, as you said, there are, it's not just one person, one bear chasing us down a ravine. This is actually everybody. All the computers are against us, kind of thing. So we've got to secure everything. And it's just overwhelming. And I think a lot of the money and time and effort that is wasted trying to get your head around what this standard or this group of standards actually means to me as a small company trying to do my thing. If you were to have more education about it, to have more understanding, because, manufacturers are not IT experts. They don't really understand the computers in the machines or even the computers on their desk. If I could have it explained to me in a simple way, and I knew exactly what I had to do, do I call a consultant in to help me do that? Probably that is a good idea. In the long run, that would save money. But then you've got the sticker shock for the consultancy service. Do I get tools in to do that? In the long run, of course, they're going to be great for you. But then you've got to justify the expense of those as well. So I think in this immature area, in terms of understanding about how manufacturers and what they need to do, considering the vast scope of everything that's connected to the network and all the possible risks that there are, I think we need more education. We need a little bit more guidance on a level that we can understand as manufacturers, not we as IT consultants.
Yeah.
And that would save a huge amount of cost and enable these small companies to be confident to say, yeah, let's go do that. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think overwhelming is a big word there. And it is overwhelming.
Hey, what I'm getting out of this is that it's inevitable, right? Something's going to happen. You paint a picture of, like you just said, Michael, it's not one bear chasing you down a ravine. It's everything's getting you, right? So when the inevitable happens, practically speaking, what's your advice on what a company should do? Matt, maybe start with you. Something's gonna happen inevitably, right? So is it call Matt, or does Matt say, hey, you should have called me 12 months ago, 5 years ago?
Well, yeah, no. So, just like every industry, there are lots of specializations within the cybersecurity field, and we are not forensics experts. So you could call us and we would help you find a forensic expert, but we wouldn't be the people taking an image.
So that's the first step then, finding forensics person to diagnose
that's a great question. So it depends, right? It depends on what's happening. I think it's a good idea to proactively find the person you're going to call so that you have that in your Rolodex now. However, the response is going to be specific to the situation. We have clients where 3 times a week we have a security event, and determining that that's an incident is different than an event, right? Oh, something looked bad. CrowdStrike is an endpoint protection tool, right? I'm not endorsing it, but maybe it throws an alert and I'm looking at it, something that happened, right? Some percentage of those turn out to be real and we need to do something about those, right? And usually the answer is quarantining that machine as fast as possible so that it can't talk to anything else on your network, right? You might decide that's all you want to do. You're going to re-image that device, you're going to give it to someone, or you're going to give them a new device. And that's much cheaper than forensics, by the way. So that's what we're going to do, right? But you might care who's in your network. At that point, you're going to call forensics.
Mhm.
If you have ransomware, you have to figure out if you're going to pay ransomware. Now, there's a whole other interesting debate about whether it's even legal to pay ransomware at this point, right? Which I think is, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's hard. I have a client who paid a $2-something million ransom bill, and their only regret was not having paid it faster because they had 2 or 3 days offline. And they basically said, I would have just paid it if I, knowing what I know now, I would have just paid the ransomware, the ransom. Which is, I mean, another eye open. I didn't necessarily agree with that. I didn't, but it's just an interesting point of view, right?
Business decision, isn't it?
Yeah. So, Michael, what's your opinion? I mean, when incidents happen, I'm assuming there's got to be some type of a recovery plan. Hopefully it's been thought out, right? Like Matt, you're saying, think about these things in advance. Do a lot of companies have those, or is that something that we're just on the cusp of right now?
Yeah, we're in early stages. I don't think people have the guy in the Rolodex. I don't think people have really thought about it. They're putting their head in the sand in some cases and hoping it won't happen. The IT guys, by the way, are going absolutely crazy because they know. And, for their voices to be heard, sometimes it's quite difficult, because how do you plan for a catastrophe if you believe that catastrophe can be avoided? So, I endorse what Matt said. Get everything aligned and understand those procedures. And if and when anything happens, think only about your customer. Don't think about yourself, because if you hide anything or delay anything, things can get very bad, very much worse, very much quickly. If your decision is to pay the 2 million, do it. Just do it. If that's your decision, if you think that's right as a manufacturer. And there will be, of course, different scenarios, but you need to think fast, be prepared, and do whatever it takes. Network segmentation, machine isolation, as we've said, there's a lot of very basic things you can do. There's even software now you can run on your OT network that analyzes the operation of machines. It builds a little signature for what machines are doing in terms of their data flow and operation. And if anything changes, it launches a thing that says there may be a cyber attack going on. It may be just that the machine needed maintenance, who knows? But, it's giving you those heads up. So the more heads up you can have, the better it is. But be prepared, as Matt said as well, so that when this thing happens, you are protecting yourself, but mostly the customer, and, isolating it as much as you can.
I agree 100% about putting the customer first. I would also say a communication plan is very important, and getting communication right is a big part of how you'd fare in 6 months after a breach.
Hey, I'm curious. I mean, Industry 4.0 digital transformation is pretty overwhelming anyway. This whole thing of cybersecurity just seems to make it even more overwhelming, slightly scary. Do you think the cybersecurity risks are delaying digital adoption in some cases? Do you think it slows people down? Or do you think people just blindly push on?
No, it stopped people altogether. I've been in a few frustrating meetings where we've been extolling the virtues of how much you can get data to work for you and all the rest of it. And the guys are sitting there saying, nope, we're not going to do that.
Here.
They have air gaps between their networks. They will not talk to each other. They don't believe that anything is possible. And they're not facing reality, because the reality is that those machines are working. What are they doing? They're making products. So design data got in there somehow, not by this network connection, obviously. And then you've got that dashboard over there, and you've got that report over there. You've got your compliance report over here. How did that data get between the two networks then? Somebody with a USB stick, somebody reading it from one screen and typing it into another screen? I don't think so. No. So there are, the more you try to avoid problems, even in the most extreme conditions, you actually end up having more risk, because USB sticks can easily be compromised if they're not controlled properly. So you have to have, it's as Matt said, you have to have this risk-based strategy and understand what you do. But do I see this stopping people in their digital transformation? Yeah, absolutely. And more so now than before. I think before it was the main defense companies that really knew this was a problem, but now that's beginning to filter to many, many other companies.
Yeah, and people are more aware. Yeah. Scary thought.
Matt, what do you think on that? I see you're.
I'm agreeing that it makes the transformation process harder, but I look at it as something that just needs to get woven in. It's part of the fiber of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And much of what you're doing in a digital transformation process is new anyway. And so there's a lot, like agreeing with Michael, there are a lot of challenges in embracing this change. And I do think every organization is different. Certainly some organizations can continue doing things exactly the way they are, and that's okay, right? I don't think every company needs to become a tech company, but I think there's a reason why the expression software is eating the world exists, which is like there are different opportunities and a whole different sort of way business can work that you're going to miss if you don't think about digital transformation. And it may be okay let that bus run, and you don't need to be on it. But if you're on it, cybersecurity needs to be part of the fabric of what you're doing.
Okay. I thought bears were eating the world. That was my concern.
What was that?
I thought it was bears that were eating the world. I'm concerned about bears right now.
Hey, but it strikes me, Matt, as you're talking, that the size of the company and its ability to respond is certainly an issue here, right? And what their wherewithal is, even how advanced they are from an IT perspective.
That's true, but I would counter with small companies can often change faster than big companies. Yeah. And what we need to do with cybersecurity might be start a new process. Well, starting a new process in a company of 10,000 employees where it needs to get written down and go through legal and be approved and then be trained and then be tested takes a lot more work than deploying a process in a shop with 50 people or 100 people, where you can kind of decide you're doing it, check it a couple of times, correct it, and now everybody's basically doing things in a more secure way. And all it took was a 15-minute meeting or something like that. We have one client where every time somebody gets a phishing or smishing is SMS phishing attack, they post it in a Slack channel, and so everybody's hyper aware that this is happening all the time. Right.
And are big companies bigger targets?
Probably.
Yeah.
I'd just like to go back to something Matt said, because it's very, very important. Building the resilience, I think it was resilience or some similar word, into whatever you're doing is part of it. And I totally agree with that. Rather than doing something and then coming to security as an afterthought, build in the security into what you're doing. And just to boringly mention the IPC CFX, where you're sending data from point to point, it's encrypted at source, point to point. So this is an example where you may not have thought about security when implementing a messaging system on the shop floor, but guess what? It's included, and you can have that security. You can send messages over the internet on the other side of the planet as equally as securely using CFX. So, a lot of the modern tools that we have by various different vendors, they do have these things built in. And so it's part of that checking when you're putting existing processes in or modifying them, upgrading them, just to make sure that you've got these things built in.
And was that a big part of the development of CFX, Michael?
It was a key concern.
Cybersecurity in at day one?
Yeah, it was a key concern. And so we chose the AMQP as the protocol for that, which is used by the banking system on your mobile phone. You're doing banking transactions. So yeah, that's been a core part of it, because we don't want to be just within the trusted environment of the shop floor or even the factory, but even toward design teams on the other side of the planet. We want to exchange that data securely without any doubt that anybody is getting into that. So yeah, it was a very important part
of the DNA there.
Good.
Very good.
Let me, we're in respecting your time here, need to bring this to a close, but I do want to ask one last question that has to do with kind of the whole human element, right? I mean, we talk about Industry 4.0 all the time, and then I forget who said once, he said the problem with it is we're still operating with human 1.0, right? So I mean, people, adopting these changes, and people are leak, right? And and you've referenced the idea of educating that and the importance of that and training people, but speak to the element of the human element within the challenge we're talking about here.
when I think about the human element, the other idea that comes to mind is culture, and building a culture where people are mindful of not just cybersecurity, but the company's interests. So going back to the financial example I mentioned before, where somebody's directing a new purchase, right? Another example is somebody says, a very common one we see today, I get a phishing a text on my phone that says, can you buy some gift cards and send me the numbers so that I can give them to these, people that I'm meeting at lunch who are our, partners, and I need to give them a spiff or something like that, right? And it turns out, of course, that the text isn't really from the person that you think it is, and that this is just a way to get a couple $100 out of you, right? And in a company where culture and security, where the culture is around security and the company's best interests, it's okay to step back and say, does this make sense with what I'm thinking should happen? And it could be when I procure the gift card before I send it, like, oh, I'm going to think twice about that. Maybe that's not the right idea. Or it could be when I connect a device that I just bought on eBay into the shop network to play music or something like that, right? It could be, the examples are so broad that I can't write a standard, and this maybe this is reinforcing something Michael said earlier. I can't write a standard that says you should do this and not this, that covers every possible scenario, right? You need people to be thinking for themselves, and you need them to understand what could or could not benefit the company, right? And so to me, that culture part, it comes from some training, it comes from some examples, it comes from some leadership from the people who are demonstrating this and not getting upset when someone says, no, I can't get you a gift card, or even if there's friction in a legitimate process, but it's for the right reasons, and you encourage and support that. I think that's setting the right tone in terms of culture. So to me, there's a little bit of a security program that is essentially planting the seeds for that cultural aspect, where you're teaching people, we want you to be agents of, on the right side, right? And you're part of this, you're part of this whole situation.
Yeah.
We can't take care of cybersecurity in this dark room at the back of the office, right? That's not where it lives.
Yeah. It's everywhere.
Yeah, I think we have to protect people, because sometimes people are put into difficult situations. Like, here's a USB stick. This guy is going to pay you $10,000 to take that stick in and put it into a computer somewhere. It happens. That guy, okay, you could protect him by making sure that none of the USB ports work. I mean, that's a simple, kind of a simple thing. But looking at an average van driver who's moving your supercritical product from one factory to another, they could be pulled over and said, look, I know that you're carrying these particular products. Let's look in the back of the van. I'm going to see the box. It's labeled. Yep, this is the product. I've got this other box, the same label. I just want to swap them out. Don't say anything, and you will get $10,000. That guy is paid very little to drive that van. He probably doesn't even work for the thing. But if he says no, what's going to happen? He might get beaten up. He might get attacked. All kinds of bad things might happen. So on one side is a risk, the other side is a reward. Often they go for the reward. How can we protect the person in that situation? And this is just an example situation. Well, what if the guy didn't know which box it was that he had to swap out? Is he going to open every single box and find the right one? So anonymous packaging and security tamper evident labeling is very effective technology for that. So the driver says, yeah, go ahead, be my guest, but I've no idea. I can use my scanner and it just tells me a load of random numbers, but it doesn't help me identify this. So sorry, guy, I can't help you. And so we need to try and find ways to thwart the areas where people are themselves becoming vulnerable, because it's not often always a mistake. Sometimes they are put under pressure to do things in the wrong way. And so the systems and flows, practices we need to put into place are to help people not get into that situation.
Interesting. Reminds me of the old sports adage that offense always stays a little ahead of defense, right? Always.
Yeah. And Matt's comment about putting your bad guy hat on every now and again.
That's very good, actually. Yeah.
And
yeah. You've got to think like that. Yeah.
Think like a bad guy.
Yeah.
Okay. I have to wear a hat a lot, so I end up,
Well, you gotta keep the sun off.
Exactly.
You gotta stay safe.
Listen, Matt and Michael, we've gone longer than I had told you we would, but this was a very, very good conversation. I want to thank you both. This has been excellent. I think you've given us all something more to think about as we go back to our workplaces today. So, so thank you both. Hopefully we can catch up again in the future at some point and continue a conversation. So, Matt and Michael, thank you very much.